I want to welcome everyone to our investor webinar for Sona Nanotech. My name is David Regan. I have with me our Chief Medical Officer, Carmen Giacomantonio, and today is a special guest panelist, Dr. Carlos Rojas, who we'll introduce a little further. Late last year, we shared some astounding results from our first-in-human study of our targeted hyperthermia therapy as a monotherapy with late-stage immunotherapy-resistant patients. The goal of that study, of course, was to assess targeted hyperthermia therapy's safety and tolerability in human subjects and to assess its ability to spark an immune system engagement with responses in tumors. That was it. But we got more than we expected with clinical response rate of 80% and complete clearances in 6 of 10 patients. So now, after a long wait, we don't want to make you wait any longer. We're going to get into this presentation and share some further follow-up results with you. I would point out that there is a chat box that you are welcome to add questions into. We'll respond to some of them along the way, some of them at the end. But feel free to hit that button and add those questions, and we'll flick through them as we go. Of course, we're going to refer you to our forward-looking cautions in our disclosure documents. We'll make a number of forward-looking statements, so we refer you to the cautions in our disclosure documents and the risks to future unknowns identified in them. We're very pleased to have with us today our study's principal investigator, Dr. Carlos Rojas, medical oncologist and executive director of the Centro de Investigación Clínica Bradford Hill in Santiago, Chile. We consider ourselves very fortunate to have connected with Dr. Rojas, and we would look forward to working with him and his team much more in the future. So by way of agenda, we want to provide a little important context as background before we get into the actual follow-up data. And then we want to underline some of the insights generated before getting into the next steps for Sona and our priorities going forward. Of course, Sona has as its core technology uniquely biocompatible and patented gold nanorods, which are ideally suited for in vivo medical applications with nanotechnology, since they are unique amongst gold nanorods in that they do not use toxins in order for them to be manufactured into their elongated form. We believe this gold nanorod technology is a platform technology with many potential applications, some of which have already been protected with provisional patents. The rod shape allows for them to be tuned to specific wavelengths and makes them the most efficient shape of nanoparticle for converting light energy into heat. And that is exactly what we do in our targeted hyperthermia therapy, as we'll now show you in a short illustrative video.
An established melanoma persists within an immunosuppressive tumor microenvironment. In targeted hyperthermia therapy, gold nanorods are delivered directly into the tumor by intratumoral injection. Upon exposure to near-infrared laser light, the nanorods convert optical energy into heat, generating localized hyperthermia. This precisely controlled thermal stress induces tumor cell apoptosis while enhancing danger signaling and antigen presentation without damaging healthy tissue. Dendritic cells capture these tumor antigens and migrate to the lymph node, where they activate antigen-specific lymphocytes and drive immune cell expansion. These activated immune cells then return to the tumor, infiltrate the tissue, and eliminate remaining cancer cells.
So this is indicative, but gives you a sense of what's going on and what our THT therapy entails. Before we get into the update with our first-in-human study, though, we want folks to understand the scientific context for the protocol we pursued. When developing the protocol for that important study, we were not simply throwing spaghetti at the wall trying to figure out what might work. It was informed by numerous preclinical studies, and we want to take you through our thinking on how the protocol was developed, as we think it will be helpful in interpreting the further results that Carmen and Dr. Rojas will share shortly. So I'll ask Carmen to take us through some of those preclinical studies and what the thinking was there.
Yeah, so thank you, David. And if people can't hear me, just to indicate on the chat box and I'll speak a little louder. So as David indicated, what we intended to do was to analyze in preclinical models what might be the path forward. As I've said to you in past webinars, I've used hyperthermia in many forms to treat cancer over the last 25 years. And of course, all of it with modest responses and lots of toxicity. When we started to apply targeted hyperthermia, we drove fever range heat into tumors to drive immunity. That was the goal. So what you can see in this, there's a slide up here, and the first slide shows a couple of things that are very important. First thing is this this yellow graph separates from the blue graph um, as we move along past the treatment time, which is here, through to day 4. And that division and what's happening right here in these first 4 days is what we hoped and believed would be the initiation of an immune response. Now, the curves change, and lots of you are saying, yeah, but that curve is changing and going there. And this is, of course, another time point that we wanted to address. But when we analyzed this at 2 and 4 days, what we found was this. Now, I apologize for this. There's lots of graphs and too much information here for any one person to see in a minute or two. But what these essentially show is that when we managed to achieve 44 degrees on average in this tumor microenvironment, we achieved a tremendous immune response. We sparked an immune response. This volcano plot, everything in red here is immune things being turned on. And all of these things call immune cells to the tissue. And this little graph right down here is super important because you heard in the little vignette that what we intend to do with targeted hyperthermia is liberate tumor antigens and through the process of apoptotic cell death. That means killing the cells through their own natural processes, not heating them, burning them, or ablating them. And so we achieve that, and these are the indicators of an immunogenic, in other words, a death response that's associated with triggering an immune response. So we had to ask that question. When I go back to that graph here, so this the second thing that's striking is, hey, what's going on here? It's all growing back. And so the first thing you think is, gee, did it work? Now, as I just showed you, the immunology is there. It worked. So the question is, what do we do with that uptick? And the way we addressed it at least initially is to say, well, what would happen if we put a second laser, a second hyperthermic treatment right there, and it did what we hoped it would do, is it flattened the curve again. And as we analyzed it again, and it's essentially the same data, this is immunity, and that immunity is fantastic. So the logical next step in a preclinical basic lab like mine is, what would happen if we tried to exploit, if we capitalized on that immunity? And how do we do that? Well, we do it with immune enablers, checkpoint inhibitors, cytokines. There's a number of things. In my clinic, in my human clinic, I use interleukin-2 in almost every patient I see. And when I do that, what I see is a response that this curve actually flattens. And so this is the area that we're targeting. And this is the hope that by adding IL-2, we get an effect. So when we added IL-2, and you see in this graph here that you see this is controls, nothing happened. IL-2 alone, nothing happened. And that's critically important. Interleukin-2 without some kind of immune activity already underway has no effect whatsoever. You've already seen this targeted hyperthermia graph, and this is the combination of targeted hyperthermia and interleukin-2, and that is to straighten that line right out. And so this is exactly what we'd hope to see, that the immune triggering by targeted hyperthermia enables an immune response that would otherwise not be experienced with immune agents alone. So you would think the next thing then is to go into a clinical trial. However, this targeted hyperthermia is brand new. And so to do a first in human study, we were first required to do this as a monotherapy, largely to prove that it's safe and tolerable by patients, and it can be adapted and adopted by treaters. And so that's our first foray into this, is to actually test the monotherapy. And to look at it another way, if you start a trial and you have more than one agent in the trial that has efficacy and there are complications, it's almost impossible to tease out which is responsible for what. So the targeted hyperthermia was the necessary next step. So this brings us to our first in human clinical trial. So our first in human clinical trial is, again, our primary objective is safety. Can we do this? Can patients tolerate it? Can treaters use it? Tolerability. What will be the tolerability? And when we started this trial, and Dr. Roja will attest to this, there were things we had to do to make this more pleasant for patients because it's technically an injection, and so we know that there's lots of people don't like needles. However, that these small obstacles were easily overcome. And then through the course of this process, we were able to do some very critical modifications to the way the device handle worked and how we treated patients and how we positioned them. But these were the primary objectives. The secondary objective was, can we trigger immune engagement? And what's very exciting, and I'm going to ask Dr. Rojas to speak to, is we surpassed our primary objectives and our secondary objectives well beyond what we'd hoped for. So our first in human study follow-up now, Dr. Rojas, I wonder if you can share your take on the results, and maybe we'll have a small discussion about what this all means.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you for the invitation, for the trial, of course, on this webinar. We also were really happy with the results. I want to say that this trial, like Carmen said, is focused in know the safety of this procedure. Of course, if we are doing hyperthermia to a patient, we need to know that this is safe and we are not harming anyone with this kind of treatment. And I think that the most relevant conclusion of this trial is that this is really safe, it's really simple, it's really easy to do it. We do this, we don't need an OR, for example. This can be do in a procedure box, in a box of medical attention, with no anesthesia, just local management, and I think that is really important because one of the most important issues that we have when we are doing therapeutical procedures in medicine is that in some cases these are really complex and need a lot of infrastructure, like for example in an OR to do it, and of course that makes difficult the treatment. In this case was really simple. Of course we count with the help of Carmen here in Chile when we treat those patients, but it was easy, was feasible, and like we said, it was monotherapy. We were just exploring the safety, and like they said, we saw, and this is my opinion, that we saw more local response, and even in some cases distant response, that we were not waiting for that, because this is really a small trial and was not the primary objective. I don't know if you are going to show now
Yeah,
the follow-up. Yeah. Well,
So those, of course, were yeah, go ahead.
yeah. Yes, these are the 10 patients that we treated in like 6 to 8 weeks. Like David said, all of those patients were patients with IO refractory melanoma. So of course, see a response in those cases. It's complicated and it's difficult, and it's not comparable to a naive patients, because a naive patient will have a really higher chance to respond to any IO treatment. All of these patients were patients that was previously or were being exposed to IO, monotherapy with nivolumab or pembrolizumab, and in some cases to a combination. Um, and with, for example, ipi/nivo or relatlimab plus nivolumab, and the patients were progressing to those treatment, progressed before or are progressing, and they are being treated beyond progression. Okay. I think that one important thing is that this is a non-ablative procedure. Of course, this is not radiotherapy, and this is not an ablative, I don't know, like for example, radiofrequency or something like that. So of course, we were not waiting a so high local response, because this is not trying to kill the tumor by itself. It's trying to um, generate an immune response in these cases that are not responding to IO. And we saw a lot of response. Of course, this is the first the treatment and the observation of the patient 2 weeks and 4 weeks and after the first treatment. And like you can see, this is our pathological review. We had a high number of patients with complete response. This is local response. This is not a complete response on the metastatic patient. This is just showing that this was safe and was locally good. And in the longer term follow-up, you have another boxes there, right, David? Yes. Well, we are following those patients. Of course, we have some patient dead because, like we said, a lot of those patients were progressing. And with this monotherapy treatment, we were not hoping to have a so strong response, because this is just exploratory. But we saw three patient of 10. I think is a very well number if you compare some treatments that we use in this scenario with a combination of IO and so forth. You will be seeing response between 10 to 15%. In this case, of course, this is not a conclusion because this is really a small trial, but we are seeing that at least three patients stop progressing with no other therapy, and the patient were treated at the middle 2025. So we have like more than 6 months of follow-up, and I think that that is interesting. Of course, I'm not concluding that this is a conclusion that this treatment will be strong enough by itself to be a standard of care in the future. But I think that this is a good start. This is a good thing to think in combinations. I think that this can be a good primer for maybe, for example, an abscopal effect, like we are seeing in some cases with radiotherapy and with other kind of intratumoral treatments. And maybe the combination with some systemic and intratumoral therapies can be this a good booster to have a stronger response in patient with hot IO tumors, but that they are not responding, and maybe can be part of the front line being combined with some IO or something like that.
Excellent. Carmen, do you want to have any comments?
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, that was, when we saw these responses, we were very excited because the response was so dramatic. Responding in 2 weeks, really, after 1 week we saw a dramatic response, but in 2 weeks we thought, like, this has to be something. We were excited to look at it in combination with an immune therapy, and it screams that this is the trigger that we were looking for in this melanoma. What surprised us was the durability, as you said. These patients, 3 out of 10 patients, have had durable responses with a monotherapy, and that is, I think, I don't, I don't want to overstate it, but it's difficult not to state in fact that is a remarkable accomplishment. And what I believe it speaks to, my hypothesis and our motivation to continue forward with the combination, as you have indicated, is that this is all based on novel immunity, on new antigen presentation. And so we have a picture. I just want to show the viewers a picture of a patient as an example that's in one of those patients we just talked about, where if you see this is you just show a picture of that patient here. This patient, if you just comment, this was patient number 7, patient with late stage melanoma, and what we see there is a field of lesions. There's a couple of dominant lesions in the picture, and then there's a whole field of lesions that are diffusely scattered throughout that network of skin and lymphatics. When we treat it, we treated, you can see those spots. That's what we treated. But what we saw after only the first week is not only did the lesions respond, and again, as Dr. Rojas had indicated, this was not, we didn't burn them or ablate them or we treated them with moderate heat. We saw this regional response. Now, this regional response, the technical definition of an abscopal response is response in a tumor that wasn't directly treated. And so the reason the immune assumption that's happening here is that response in those other lesions is generated from the immunity that was triggered by the treated lesions. Dr. Roja, could I ask you, when you see this, what is, and I value your honest opinion, what is your interpretation of that response at 7 days?
No, this is clear and abscopal response, that it's similar to that was being looking, for example, with intratumoral virus, oncolytic virus. The effect that there's a lot of evidence that show that the lesion treated had some change in the in the microambient, the tumoral microambient, and I think that we're seeing something similar with this. And in some cases, for example, and one of the question about that is asking about patient 3. We didn't saw response locally in the lesion that we treat. The evaluation was made by biopsy. No, it's not a CAT scan. So if we put there that we didn't saw response, is because the tumor was still there. But of course, we are not seeing or looking what is happening with the immune system of that patient with this treatment. And for example, in that case, if the patient is still ongoing and no progressing and with no other treatment, in this case, because this patient was out of IO in that moment, just on palliative care, of course, I think that is some an example of some clinical distant abscopal effect. This is local. Is really near from the lesion, but in that case, for example, I don't have any other explanation to see what were happening because the patient was previously progressing. I think that this is a good hypothesis, and like David said, like Carmen said, and like I previously said, we're seeing response locally more than we were hoping, and also near to the tumor but not treated, and also in some cases more distance.
Yeah.
So I think that this is a good therapy doing some immunomodulation. And in that case, I think that we have a strong hypothesis to try to go further with using this with another kind of treatments like electronic.
I couldn't agree more. And so we just show this. We put this slide up for contrast, just so the viewers can see. It's quite remarkable. I mean, as a treater, when we see this, we're taken aback a little bit that this is after 1 week after the second treatment or 2 weeks after the initiation without the addition of drug, just as a monotherapy. And so, this notion of abscopal effect, and again, because we have a spectrum of viewers here today. This is again the response in a tumor remote from the tumor that was treated, essentially is a scopal. And the more we're able to move that response in the local tumor, the more likely we are to see the response happen distant, because those cells, those immune cells that come to fight those tumors, have to come from regional lymph nodes via the blood system, which actually circulates through the entire body, making everything in its path potentially a target. And so this was the experience, and we're very happy with that.
So, Dr. Rojas, can I ask you, that was patient number 7. What was their reaction to seeing the abscopal effect happen on that leg?
Give me 1 second to open that because I remember the names more than the numbers. 1 second. Patient 7. What was the question? Sorry.
I'm wondering what their reaction was, the patients, when they would see a strong response rate, particularly when they knew they had, 3 or 4 tumors treated, and yet they saw other lesions shrinking. Did they have a response to that?
Yeah. I don't have a clear answer. I think that the IO that the patient was receiving was not doing the job by itself, and I think that this was a good booster. That's my hypothesis.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah,
Mhm.
fair enough.
Because we saw some response in this case, um, like Carmen shows in a part of the tumor that was not being treated. So I think that that is abscopal effect. I don't know if this was just the THT, or this was the THT plus the IO that the patient previously received. I think that this act like a booster. That's my opinion. I think that we will be seeing better results combining this with IO. I think that Carmen shows in the preclinical trials that this was stronger when was combined with an IO treatment. In the case of interleukin 2, I think that this will be a good treatment to combine more than monotherapy. I think that we saw good results as a monotherapy, but I think that most of those results are related to the previous IO received or the IO that the patient were receiving. But something good is that in some cases we had the chance to revert the progression and to restart a good response that the patient were not showing because they were progressing.
Yeah,
Previously.
absolutely.
We agree.
Yeah. So this is to kind of summarize what the objectives again were: to prove that we could do this safely, and patients could tolerate it well. And so what the additional learnings from it is, when we first wrote the trial, we presented it at 42 to 48 degrees. And the logistics and the biology of it is that we achieved about 44 degrees in every patient, and that's all documented. And so 44 degrees, that's a temperature that doesn't denature protein. It begins to denature protein. It doesn't kill the cells, but it results in antigen presentation. And that's affirmed that that's the temperature we go into the next trial with. That's critically important. 5 minutes is sufficient. This is another thing that I'll say, and Dr. Rojas would probably attest to. To do something for 5 minutes is, and that's the end of it, is remarkable. I mean, that's a very short treatment. There is a process of getting the patient into the clinic, setting them up, freezing, treating, etc. But it's 5 minutes of treatment itself, which is quite remarkable. On our next trials, we'll look at 2 5 minutes versus 1 5 minutes. Of course, there's lots of variables, but our fundamental trial gives us a very strong footing to start our next trial with. 2 treatments are associated with a significant response, and at 2 weeks was a revelation. We had no idea. We could tell you from the preclinical models that was probably the case, but preclinical models, first thing somebody will say to me, well, that's mice. Well, this is humans, and so this is very reassuring. And again, just to reiterate, and I know I'm hitting this hard on the head, but to see these lesions respond and not to see regrowth, as our preclinical model predicted we probably would see, is remarkable. Now, Dr. Rojas correctly said there's lots of unknowns in that. These patients had failed IO, they were IO resistant, but it could be based on their previous IO that we experienced that. In fact, our preclinical testing would suggest that the addition of IO of some kind, interleukin-2 checkpoint inhibitor, is the necessary second ingredient to make this carry through to its completion. And so, again, this is an incredibly valuable experience for us that brings us, excitedly towards next steps, which I'll hand over to David to carry on with.
Thank you. So, we saw the enduring effect in those 3 patients, which is 30%. Dr. Rojas rightly points out, what is the cause and effect there? It's not exactly clear, but it's good stuff that we're seeing. And given that today's standard of care, immunotherapy, tends to work less than half of the time, this all begs the question, what would happen if Sona's THT immune activation priming function were to be combined with concurrent immunotherapy? So as we go into next steps, we are definitely excited to start a study of THT with immunotherapy in humans. On that front, we are in discussions with Health Canada, whose assessment of risk considers factors such as things like nanoparticles biodistribution, potential for bioaccumulation and toxicity, the possibility of systemic exposure of the gold nanorods, and the extent of the validation and verification work that is done around our near-infrared light device, amongst other things, of course. Getting into and certainly completing a major regulator-sanctioned clinical trial is a major milestone and would be, we believe, a significant valuation catalyst because it effectively signals that you're one step closer to potential commercialization. However, as many of you have noted and have seen, Health Canada is significantly backload due to a combination of resource constraints and an increase in volume of applications. So much so that they've implemented a number of different programs just in January, identifying the fact that they'll use their regulatory enrollment process, which is an intake a streamlining process. They're also announcing greater reliance on foreign regulators and accepting what has been approved in other jurisdictions. They've increased their rejection rates, and they have also enhanced their triage process to really focus in on the applications that have higher relevance. So in this environment, it's pretty difficult for us to even guesstimate what the timing might be, but we can say the application has not been rejected, and we believe that it's benefiting tremendously from the triage protocols they've put in place, and we continue those conversations, which is all I can say about that at this point. Also, all of our research tells us that it's not just melanoma that can be treated with THT, but potentially all solid tumors, which of course, sadly, represents a massive global market. It therefore also a priority for us to broaden the clinical indications that could be addressed by THT. This too, obviously, could serve as a major valuation catalyst, as its success would highlight the potential to serve a much wider audience. And to do that, we've got to produce studies, we've got to show data, both preclinical and clinical. Looking back, of course, when we shared the initial results from this study, we let folks know that we were going to be heads down for a while we digested those results and consulted with experts to plot our path forward, because it opens many doors for us. But it has clearly been longer wait than many had wanted, ourselves included. Well, we've been chomping at the bit to really push things forward. Some science can't always be rushed. That said, we now have a clear line of sight on being able to share more important information with you this spring, and we are very excited to be able to do so as these developments occur. Amongst those developments that we expect to have are 2 more research papers generated by Carmen and his lab, expected to be published in peer-reviewed journals. First, there is a greatly anticipated colorectal preclinical study, which I'm very pleased to report is currently under review with the Journal of Nanobiotechnology. This research paper holds some key insights into how a combination therapy might be structured and what we could expect the results to show. Second, the full data from this study, this first-in-human study that was done under Dr. Rojas, along with the follow-up histology data that is expected soon, but has not been received yet, is expected to be written up and submitted for peer review later this spring. It's really important to note that in our industry, data effectively does not exist, and often will not be accepted for review by potential strategic partners, institutional investors, until it has been peer-reviewed and published in a highly regarded journal. The good news I can tell you is that the Journal of Nanobiotechnology has an impact factor of 13 and is very highly regarded. So we're really excited and hopeful for that to be published. Circling back to our clinical strategy going forward, we also expect to be able to share more information with you on the studies we intend to pursue, their protocols, and the scientific, business, and industry rationale for why we've chosen the specific studies to do in the future and the specific protocols associated with them. So we've certainly had a quiet start to the year, but with these developments in this webinar, we hope you'll agree that we think 2026 is lining up to be a banner year for Sona and potentially for the growing numbers of people suffering from cancer, and of course, everyone looking for a brighter future in that regards. We'll look to take a couple more questions here to see if there's any others coming along. There were, Carmen, there were questions on, there was a question around the correlation on tumor characteristics, whether there was any correlation between specific tumor characteristics and the degree of clearance seen. Can either of you guys comment on that or hypothesize on that?
Maybe Dr. Rojas is the PI.
I think it's too difficult because there's not so much patience. So I think that if we try to conclude something that is so specific, maybe we will be concluding something that is wrong. I think that for give an answer to that question, we need a bigger trial, looking more signs of efficacy, and in that case, explore some subgroups. But for just 10 patients, I think that try to have a correlation between subtypes or something like that will be really difficult, and maybe can conduct us to a bad conclusion.
That's a fair.
Yeah, that's fair. There's also a clarifying question around patient number 7, who showed the abscopal effect, and questions around whether they received immunotherapy, prior to those photos documenting the abscopal effect. Of course, those photos were from during the trial, which was a monotherapy at the time.
Yes, this patient received previously IO monotherapy with pembrolizumab, progressed to that, and this was treated just with this THT monotherapy, and the patient didn't receive nothing in the trial and after that.
That's it. That's it. Interesting. So there are other questions we're receiving here as far as the rough costs of projects going forward. We will detail that on our next webinar that we hope to hold in a few weeks when we have our clinical strategy buttoned down. I think one of the things we can say is that we've been very capital efficient, and we look for being able to provide good torque in terms of the investments we make in these studies, and we think they're all studies that are relatively affordable. Of course, we've talked about the possibilities of going back, working with Dr. Rojas again, which we would love to do. The Canadian Health Canada sanctions study, which is something that could be done under to some extent under the auspices of Dr. Giacomo Antonio here in Halifax. So we will have more information on that in the coming weeks. Anything else here you want to? No, I think that's good. And expansion plans. We will look forward to updating you on that. What can investors look forward to coming forward? I think I've touched on that. We've got a number of things we're hopeful for in the coming weeks. And financing questions. Of course, we're a pre-revenue company, so we look to be opportunistic. We have been able to benefit from some non-dilutive financing to some extent, but we'll look to be opportunistic. And of course, any funds raised, we'd look at matching those to exactly the needs for the next study and the next valuation catalyst, which is typical in our industry. So with that, Dr. Rojas, I want to thank you very, very much for your time, both in the study and for today coming in, and really look forward to working with you again, we hope.
Thank you for the invitation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out. We didn't get to all the questions. We'll collate those perhaps and get them out to some responses out in a broader email blast to our followers. If you're not already signed up on our website to our email newsletters, please do so, and happy to speak to you at any time. Many thanks.
Take care.
Goodbye.